Crystal City Internment Camp, Crystal City, Texas, December 12, 1944. The truck came in under a sky so low and colorless that it felt less like weather than a lid pressed down over the whole of South Texas, and the people sitting shoulder to shoulder in the wooden bed of that truck stared out through the slats as if they were being carried not into a camp but into the inside of a verdict. Mud clung to the wheels. Rainwater gathered in the ruts of the road like strips of dull tin. Beyond the outer fence lay a landscape so broad and flat that many of the Germans, even after weeks of transport, could not believe such open land belonged to the same planet as the bomb-broken streets and cramped stations of Europe they had left behind. Some of those on the truck were captured soldiers taken in France after the collapse of German lines in the West, men with hollow faces and uniforms that no longer looked like uniforms so much as tired cloth hanging from tired bones. Others were German civilian internees, women pulled from expatriate communities in Latin America or from suspect households swept into the machinery of wartime detention because their language, their passports, their surnames, or their correspondence had marked them as part of the enemy's shadow. There were men in field gray, women in worn coats, one old violin case with no violin in it, 2 children too frightened to cry loudly, and a silence among the adults more revealing than panic would have been. They had been told too much for silence to mean peace. They had been told that America was a nation of smiling brutality, a place where wealth had made people soft in spirit and hard in punishment, where the enemy was never merely defeated but displayed, where humiliation was administered with clean hands and perfect teeth. Again and again, through propaganda, barracks talk, newspapers, speeches, and the private theater of fear that men carry inside them, they had been taught that capture by the Americans would not be simple imprisonment. It would be a lesson. It would be mockery with paperwork. It would be food measured just enough to preserve labor, kindness used as bait, and order itself turned into a form of contempt. So when the truck rolled past barbed wire, flood lamps, watchtowers, and a wooden gate reinforced with fresh bolts, they did not see a camp arranged by practical minds. They saw the architecture of everything they had been told to dread. Karl Brenner saw it with the exhausted eyes of a 31-year-old man who had once worked the rail lines in Cologne, and then spent the war watching one system after another claim to be permanent just before it cracked apart. Otto Weiss saw it with the terrified alertness of 19, his youth still visible beneath hunger and transport fatigue. Lise Hartmann, whose husband had vanished somewhere inside the American internment system months earlier, held her jaw so tight that the muscles in her face trembled. Marta Klein, a music teacher from Hamburg, carried herself with the stunned uprightness of someone whose grief had not yet had time to find its proper posture. Around them, others climbed down into mud one by one, boots slipping, children lifted, names shouted, papers checked, bodies counted. The camp beyond the intake yard was neither theatrical nor savage. It was neat in the way only wartime institutions can be neat: rows of low wooden barracks, utility sheds, a laundry building, a mess hall, a small infirmary, storage structures, fenced lanes between compounds, water towers, chalkboards for rosters, everything arranged not to inspire awe but to enable counting, sorting, repairing, and control. That very lack of spectacle unsettled the Germans more than shouting might have. Cruelty they understood. Efficiency without visible hatred was harder to place. Near a folding registration table stood a tall American sergeant with a lean, sun-cut face and the kind of stillness that made other people move faster without being told. His name was Daniel Walker. Beside him was the camp medic, Thomas Haskins, narrower in build, with dark eyes, rolled sleeves, and a canvas satchel heavy with bandages, thermometers, ointments, and the plain tools by which one human body is forced to keep serving time inside another. They did not waste language. Names were recorded. Ranks were logged when relevant. Civilian classifications were noted. Visible wounds were inspected. Coughs were listened to. Fevers were taken. Those who looked unsteady were moved out of line for examination. A woman who could not stop coughing was sent directly to the infirmary. One frightened child clung so violently to his mother's coat that he nearly tore the seam, and rather than rip him away, one of the younger guards crouched, spoke to the interpreter, and had the message carried over softly that the boy would remain with his mother. For several of the Germans, that tiny act was more disturbing than a threat would have been, because it did not fit the script they had brought with them. They were processed, deloused where necessary, given blankets, assigned sleeping quarters, divided by compound, and marched to their first meal. The food was plain and measured with almost offensive precision. Beans, bread, thin coffee, soup. Not abundance. Not starvation. The exactness itself produced suspicion. Why measure unless scarcity was part of the design? Why keep records this carefully unless everything was preparation for some more elaborate degradation? Ernst Bremer, a former non-commissioned officer whose age had hardened him into a shape almost impossible to soften, muttered as they sat on their benches that this was how it always began. "They preserve what they intend to use," he said. "They keep you standing so they can profit from how long you fall." Several men nodded because defeat had not yet made them ready for uncertainty. Karl said nothing. He noticed the same things Bremer did, but he also noticed what Bremer chose not to see, that everyone in line received the same ladle of soup, that a limping prisoner was not struck for slowing the file, that a woman at the far end of the hall was given hot water for a child without having to beg twice, that Haskins crossed from table to table looking for signs of collapse, not with the eyes of a butcher inspecting livestock, but with the concentration of a man who had spent too many years fighting infection, dehydration, and foolishness in equal measure. That first night, almost no one slept well. Wind moved through the seams of the buildings. Somewhere beyond the wire, a loose sheet of metal banged in irregular bursts. The Texas dark felt enormous, too empty to be trusted. In Europe, even ruined Europe, night still held familiar structures: bell towers, tram lines, close roads, the hush of towns gathered against one another through centuries. In Texas, darkness seemed to belong to distance itself. Karl lay on his bunk, listening to Otto breathe too fast on the bed above him, and thinking not of America, not even of war, but of how strange it was that fear could survive crossing an ocean and still arrive ahead of the body. In the women's quarters, Lee sat awake with her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, while Marta listened to a child whimper in sleep and tried to imagine a piano so vividly that she could almost hear a chord. The next morning the camp revealed its rhythm. Reveille. Washington count. Breakfast. Medical checks if needed. Work assignments. Return. Count again. Cleaning. Evening quiet. The men fit for labor were sometimes sent out under guard to fields, depots, or local work sites. The women deemed able were assigned laundry, kitchen detail, sewing, storage organization, small garden work, or tasks within the compound. Letters could be written in controlled formats, subject to censorship. Religious services were permitted at intervals. Rules were posted and explained through interpreters. Escape attempts would be met with force. Fighting would be punished. Theft would be punished. Medical cases would be treated. From the American side, the rules were delivered not as moral theater but as administrative fact. That offended many of the Germans at first, because contempt can be fought more easily than indifference to one's pride. Yet the camp was not indifferent in the way they had expected. It was simply governed by a bureaucratic morality that treated order as a duty. If a roof leaked, repair crews came. If the water pump faltered, someone fixed it. If a man developed a fever, he was examined. If a woman gashed her hand in the laundry, she was bandaged and excused from work. When Otto fainted during one of his first work details under the late autumn Texas sun, Karl braced himself for the crack of abuse, but what came instead was Walker crossing the field in long, efficient strides, kneeling once, looking at Otto's face, and saying, "Heat and weakness," with a certainty that translated itself even before the interpreter did. Haskins had the boy moved into shade, the canteen tipped slowly against his mouth, his pulse checked, his neck cooled, and his work detail cut short. That evening, Bremer still insisted it was calculation. "Of course they don't want him dead in the dirt," he said. "Dead men don't work." But Otto, pale and embarrassed, could not forget the wet cloth placed at the back of his neck or the way Walker had not looked at him as though collapse were a moral failure. In the women's compound, Lise was taken to the infirmary after a chest infection returned. She expected interrogation, perhaps rough handling, some kind of transaction in which treatment would be used to extract obedience or gratitude. Instead, she received a cot, medicine, an examination, a stern order to rest, and the quietly infuriating experience of being cared for by the enemy with no melodrama attached to it. Marta split the skin of her palm while wringing heavy sheets, and a guard called for help so quickly that she found herself sitting on a wooden chair while Haskins cleaned the wound and wrapped it with practiced hands. The difficulty for the Germans was not merely that the Americans behaved better than expected. It was that this better behavior could not easily be dismissed as softness. The guards still carried rifles. The fences still stood. The gates were still locked. Men and women were still counted, confined, moved according to orders, and reminded without apology that they were prisoners or internees. Yet at every turn, force was paired with maintenance, restriction with procedure, discipline with an unwillingness to descend into cruelty merely because cruelty was available. That was a form of power many of the Germans had never been taught to recognize. It did not flatter them. It gave them nowhere easy to place their hatred. Through late December the weather cooled. Wind found its way through cracks in the barracks. The camp distributed extra blankets. Gaps in the walls were patched. Soup grew slightly thicker on colder evenings. In the kitchen line, people began to notice things they had not wanted to notice at first, that the Americans did not underfeed children to make a point, that older prisoners were sometimes moved to lighter duties without being mocked, that Haskins checked on lingering coughs even when no one requested him. Then came Christmas. No one expected much. The holiday had become for many of them a dangerous room inside memory, a place full of absences. But a chaplain was allowed into the camp. The administration approved a modest service. No ornament worth the name existed, only a few evergreen branches wired above a rough table, some lantern light, and the brittle politeness of war temporarily making space for ritual. Yet when the first notes of Silent Night rose into the cold hall, something shifted. Marta sang softly, each word measured as though she were stepping barefoot across broken glass. Otto sang too loudly because youth sometimes chooses bad volume over sorrow. Lise could not sing at all for the first verse. Karl stood near the back and watched faces change under the unsteady light, German, tired, guarded, some with tears, some with jaws set hard against them. Outside the hall, beyond the windows, an American guard paused in the dark to listen. On the final repetition of the melody, he hummed the English words under his breath. No one spoke of it afterward, yet almost no one forgot it. The new year brought news from Europe in fragments. Snow, the Ardennes, fierce fighting, casualties, setbacks, sudden advances, names of places turned into tones of voice before they became information. The Americans were not machines. Brothers, sons, and husbands of theirs were still in combat. This reality entered the camp not through speeches but through the human leakage of grief, a telegram delivered at the office, a corporal speaking too softly with another near the supply shed, a guard arriving for duty with the exhausted face of a man who had not slept because someone else would never sleep again. Walker received one such telegram in January. Karl saw it happen from across the yard during count formation. An orderly handed over the envelope. Walker read it once, folded it, read it again, and stood still so completely that even at a distance Karl could feel the force required to remain upright. By evening, through the circuit of whispers that no camp can prevent, the Germans learned the truth. Walker's younger brother had been killed in Belgium. The knowledge spread through the compounds like a fresh crack in ice. If the Americans truly were what the Germans had been taught, surely this would be the moment when restraint ended and revenge took a recognizable shape. Surely the man who now had a dead brother because the war still ground on would choose, if only once, to turn the machinery of captivity into a more personal instrument. But nothing of the sort happened. Walker grew quieter, perhaps harder around the mouth, but his conduct did not change. He did not cut rations. He did not single anyone out. He did not allow insults or retaliatory roughness to become policy through his silence. He enforced regulations exactly as before. To Bremer, this was intolerable evidence. He wanted hatred to prove itself. He needed it to. Without that confirmation, too many of the foundations under him began to shift. The winter months passed in the heavy monotony by which camps erased time while somehow making each day weigh more than the last. Letters began to arrive, late and censored and miraculous. One man learned that his street in Bremen no longer existed. Another received a postcard from a wife in Cologne saying only that she and the children were alive and that coal mattered more than mourning. A woman in the internee compound discovered that her parents had disappeared during a transfer and that no one could say where. Otto received nothing for weeks and stood each distribution day with a face trying not to expect anything. Lise at last got word that her husband had been transferred again, perhaps north, perhaps east, no certainty attached to the rumor. Marta learned her sister in Hamburg had died in an air raid. She sat for an hour afterward on the edge of her bunk with both hands laid flat against her knees, not moving, as though motion itself might break the thin discipline keeping her grief from swallowing her whole. The Americans distributed these letters without commentary. That restraint, more than any formal sympathy, struck Karl with peculiar force. A guard saw a man stagger from bad news and simply cleared space around him. Haskins sat beside a woman long enough to make sure she would not faint and then left without trying to own the moment with consoling speeches. The camp's discipline remained dry, but within it lived a form of respect many of the Germans had not believed possible from an enemy. Then March came, and with it the storm that would divide memory in the camp into before and after. The day had been wrong from morning. The air felt swollen, thick enough to taste. Wind shifted without pattern. The clouds lowered until the whole sky seemed to be crouching. By afternoon, even those who knew nothing of Texas weather could tell that something violent was collecting over the flatlands. Rain began after dusk and almost immediately ceased to behave like ordinary rain. It struck the roofs in hard sheets. It ran sideways beneath eaves. It filled the shallow lanes between buildings and turned the open ground into moving black water. Electrical lines hissed. Somewhere metal slammed in frantic rhythm. In the western section of the compound stood an older storage building temporarily housing several German women, children, 2 elderly men, and a few overflow cases from repairs elsewhere in camp. Lise and Marta were inside that structure among roughly 24 others. Karl and Otto, in the men's barracks not far away, had just settled to their bunks when the first shout rose through the storm. Then came the flash. It was impossible later to say whether lightning struck a line, a transformer, the edge of the roof, or some wet point in the old structure where wiring had long been suspect. What everyone remembered was the white burst that erased darkness for half a second and the sharp, splitting report that followed. Then, almost at once, the smell arrived. Not lantern smoke. Not kitchen heat. Burned pitch. Wet wood catching wrong. Something electrical and furious. The alarm bell began a moment later, stabbing through the rain. Men surged up from bunks. Women in the western building screamed as the side wall glowed orange through the cracks. Someone shouted that the west housing block was on fire. Someone else yelled for the children. The storm-fed wind turned sparks into weapons. By the time Karl reached the window, he could see flames running along one side of the roof while rain, rather than quenching them, seemed only to drive smoke low and thick into the structure. The old building was taking fire from above, while water from the clogged drainage ditch flooded the ground around it. Those inside were trapped between choking heat and rising panic. For many of the Germans, the first thought that flashed through them was not rescue but confirmation. This is it. This is how it happens. No firing squad, no public beating, only a locked wartime building, enemy guards outside, and the useful accident by which unwanted people ceased to be a problem. Yet what happened next shattered that thought so quickly it never fully recovered. Walker ran first. Not walked, not commanded from a safe position, ran. He had an axe in one hand before most prisoners had even made it to the doorway. Haskins came behind him with 2 others carrying blankets, crowbars, ropes, and the medic's bag. Jesse Cole, one of the youngest guards on the shift, nearly went down in the mud and caught himself with both hands, then kept moving. Orders flew in English through the rain, then in translation. Get the west gate clear. Bring stretchers. Break the side vent. Cut that section of wire. And then, most astonishingly of all, one portion of the inner fence was cut open to create a wider evacuation path. In that moment, the Americans did not pause to weigh whether terrified German prisoners might use darkness, fire, and storm as cover to flee. They chose the fastest route to saving the people inside. That decision hit Karl with almost physical force. He had been raised in a war that preached strength while training men to imagine mercy as weakness. Now, in a yard half drowned by rain, the strongest people present were the ones taking risks for those they had every excuse to hate. The trapped building had become an inferno of confusion. Inside, smoke pressed down toward the floor. Lise was trying to force a swollen door with both shoulders while holding onto a child that did not belong to her because in the scramble the boy's mother had fallen somewhere behind a row of cots. Marta was half dragging an old man toward the opposite wall where she thought a window might still be opened. Someone was praying. Someone else was coughing so hard it sounded like tearing cloth. One of the little girls had gone quiet, which was worse than crying. Then the first axe blow struck the jammed door from outside, and the sound was so abrupt and violent it briefly cut through panic itself. A second blow. A third. The frame splintered. Wind and rain burst inward. Out. Out now! The interpreter screamed from behind Walker. But panic does not exit in orderly lines. People pushed, stumbled, clutched at one another, collided, turned back for bags, for children, for letters, for one more breath. Walker shoved himself inside, followed by Cole and another guard. Haskins dropped to one knee in the mud outside the opening and began triage the instant bodies emerged. Lise came out with the child in her arms, coughing black threads into the rain. Marta was next, still twisting to look behind her because she thought she had left the old man somewhere near the rear wall. 2 more women came. Then a teenage boy. Then one of the children. Then the old man, half carried by Cole. Smoke thickened. Part of the roof gave a crack like rifle fire. Someone shouted that the rear room still held people. No one was sure how many. Cole went in through a side window after hearing a cry from the back. A moment later the ceiling dropped in partway and the yard froze. Haskins cursed. A guard yelled for everyone to fall back. But Walker was already disappearing into the smoke. Karl did not decide to follow so much as discover that his body had decided before his mind could object. Perhaps it was because Lise had barely made it out. Perhaps it was because Marta was shaking beside him and saying there was still a mother inside. Perhaps it was because he could not bear to stand in rain while the man whose brother had died in Belgium went into the fire for Germans. He wrapped a wet cloth over his mouth and ran after Walker through the broken opening. Inside, the building had ceased to be a room and become instead a red-black tunnel of heat, sparks, and disorientation. Walker was lifting a fallen beam from Cole's leg while somewhere beyond them a woman lay pinned under lighter debris, unconscious but breathing. Karl barely had time to register the scene before Walker barked one word, and though Karl did not fully understand the language, he understood the demand. They heaved together. The beam rose just enough for Cole to drag himself free. Then Karl crawled toward the woman and caught hold of her under the arms. Smoke tore at his lungs. Something above them snapped. Walker came alongside, took the woman's shoulders, and between them they half-carried, half-dragged her toward the side opening through which Cole had entered. Fire licked across a hanging curtain. The floor shifted under their boots because water had turned portions of the boards slick and unstable. For one surreal instant Karl became aware not of nations, uniforms, or the war, but only of the weight of a stranger's body and the fact that another man beside him, wearing the enemy's insignia, was carrying the same burden. They shoved Cole first through the window opening. Hands seized him from outside. Then they pushed the woman through. Then Walker practically threw Carl out after them, just as part of the ceiling behind them gave way with a roar. They spilled into mud, rain, and blinding white lightning all at once. Haskins was already there, rolling the woman onto her side, checking her airway, shouting for blankets, checking Cole's leg, barking instructions so fast the interpreter gave up trying to keep pace. The child Lees had carried recognized his mother and began wailing with a force that sounded like life returning to the world. Around them the evacuation went on. Buckets moved hand to hand. More prisoners, men now, under shouted supervision, formed lines to pass water and clear debris. No one tried to run through the cut wire. Not because escape was impossible, though it almost certainly was in that storm, but because too many were still inside and too much had just been stripped away for anyone to pretend the old categories were whole. A guard tore off his own jacket and threw it around an elderly German woman whose clothes were soaked through. Another climbed the side ladder to hack apart a section of roof venting before the entire corner ignited. Haskins moved through the mud with his face blackened by soot, his sleeves singed, his hands never still. Walker's palms were burned raw through where he had lifted hot wood, yet he refused treatment until the last missing head had been accounted for. By the time the storm slackened toward dawn, the western housing structure stood half-ruined, one end blackened open to the sky, rain hissing on hot timber. But almost everyone had survived. Burns, smoke inhalation, bruised ribs, a wrenched ankle, a cut scalp, a badly strained knee, several cases of shock, one broken arm, yet no bodies laid out beneath blankets. No names crossed off because rescue had been too inconvenient to attempt. That fact alone was enough to leave many of the Germans staring at the gray morning as though the world had become morally unrecognizable. The camp did not respond to the disaster with ceremony. It responded with labor. The displaced were moved into the mess hall, office annexes, and spare storage space. Extra cots were found. Soup was heated. Dry blankets were issued. Children were checked for fever. The infirmary ran nearly without pause. The Americans did not first repair their own quarters. They first made sure the Germans whose housing had burned would not face the cold night in damaged shelter. Again, no speech explained this. No sermon attached itself to the act. And because there was no speech, the act weighed more. Bremer, who had always had an answer for every decent thing the Americans did, sat the next morning with a burn running along one cheek and stared into his tin cup as though language had failed him at last. He was one of the last pulled out, half senseless from smoke. Otto, hair singed, hands still shaking from the bucket line, looked at him almost hopefully, waiting for the old certainty to return and restore the world to a shape he recognized. It never did. Not fully. In the days that followed, the psychological order of the camp changed. Not into friendship. Not into sentimental reconciliation. The fences remained. The rifles remained. Orders remained orders. But a kind of knowledge had entered the place that could not be removed by argument. The Germans knew the Americans had cut open the safest barrier they had in order to save enemy prisoners. They knew guards had gone into smoke and flame more than once. They knew the medic had worked in mud beside German women and children as though their lungs mattered. They knew an American sergeant with a dead brother in Belgium had not chosen revenge when fire offered him perfect cover. And from the American side, another knowledge emerged. They had seen German prisoners stay to pass water, pull debris, and help carry the injured rather than bolt into the storm through the severed wire. They had seen Carl go back inside. They had seen Lees hand off a rescued child and turn at once to help another woman stand. Mutual recognition did not erase captivity, but it altered its atmosphere in ways subtle and lasting. Marta, whose hand still shook when she heard Sudden would crack in a weeks afterward, volunteered to help calm the children at night by teaching them small songs and finger rhythms. Someone found her an old harmonica from storage, and though it was a poor substitute for a piano, she used it to stitch small islands of order back into frightened evenings. Lise began helping in the infirmary after her lungs recovered enough, cleaning instruments, boiling water, folding cloths, carrying messages between cots because she knew what it meant to be held together by hands that owed her nothing. Otto asked Haskins for the English word for bandage, then for water, then for careful, and each time the medic corrected his accent with a dryness that concealed amusement. Carl joined the work crew clearing the burned structure, and one afternoon looked up to see Walker, bandaged hands and all, picking bent nails out of the mud so no one would step on them later. That image stayed with him longer than even the rescue itself. An American sergeant, grieving, scarred, still on duty, stooping to remove hidden harm from the ground in a camp full of Germans. It was not heroic in the loud sense. It was something more difficult. It was decency without witnesses required. Then came the further shock, the one that widened the moral rupture already opened by the fire. As Allied armies advanced in Europe, the Americans ensured that German prisoners in camps such as this one were confronted, however unevenly, with documented evidence from liberated camps across the Reich. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, names that entered the Texas compound not as abstractions but as images, as descriptions, as the unbearable plainness of bodies stacked like refuse and faces starved down to accusation. The viewing was not theatrical. Newspapers circulated. Brief explanations were given. Some groups were shown photographs in a supervised room. Carl stood there with Otto, with Marta, with Lise, with Bremer farther back, and felt his mind trying and failing to make the dimensions fit together. In one part of the world, camps built by the regime he had served turned human beings into ash and inventory. In another, behind American wire, men he had been taught to call monsters had risked their lives to pull German women and children out of a burning building. The contrast was so violent it broke something in him that defeat alone had not broken. He had already lost the war. Now he lost the last shelter of certain illusions. Otto vomited afterward behind the wash shed. Marta sat down and wept not only for the dead in those photographs, but, perhaps, for the hideous scale of what had been hidden behind words like duty, order, necessity, transport, security. Lise, who had spent months sustaining herself on injury and suspicion, realized with a kind of terror that gratitude toward the Americans and horror toward Germany could exist in the same body at the same time. That knowledge left no room for easy loyalties. In May, the war in Europe ended. The camp knew it before the formal announcement by the way the American side moved, by the crackling radios, by the sudden release in shoulders that had carried news from overseas like stones. Germany had surrendered. Some guards laughed with relief. One sat down on an overturned crate and cried openly. Another lit a cigar with hands that trembled. Among the Germans the reactions fractured. Some stared at the ground as though they had been emptied out. Some crossed themselves. Some were so visibly relieved they looked ashamed of it. Otto whispered, "It's over," with the disbelief of someone who had repeated the phrase only in dreams before. Yet captivity did not end the next morning. Paperwork remained. Transfers remained. Medical inspections, transport schedules, repatriation priorities, labor obligations, bureaucratic delays. History, having shouted, now settled into the dull machinery by which great endings become long middles. At first some Germans resented this, taking continued confinement as proof that American virtue had only ever been temporary costume. But the weeks passed, and the Americans did not change character now that the enemy state had collapsed. They did not become lazily cruel. They did not use peace as an excuse to humiliate those still inside the fences. If anything, the camp grew calmer. There was more mail. Some educational material appeared. Soccer games were permitted in fenced yards. Children's routines improved. The work details continued, but the tension around them thinned. One late summer afternoon Carl cut his palm badly on twisted fence wire while working under guard at a nearby farm. The farmer, A narrow old widower whose son had gone missing in Europe and had not come back, saw the blood and immediately shouted for Haskins. The medic stitched the wound in the shade of a wagon while the old man stood nearby pretending not to worry. Before the truck returned to camp, that same farmer left a sack of bruised peaches on the tailgate, muttering that they would spoil anyway if nobody ate them. The Germans took the fruit in silence. Such gestures did not erase what had happened in the war. They did something stranger. They proved that even the bereaved could choose not to become petty tyrants over the powerless placed before them. The first larger repatriation lists began to matter in late 1945. Names were posted. Those whose numbers appeared carried their news through the camp with expressions split between joy and guilt. Otto's name came before Karl's. The boy could hardly look him in the eye for a full day. "I didn't ask to go first," he said, as though departure required apology. Karl almost smiled. "No," he said. "Your face tells me that." Before he left, Otto searched out Walker in the yard where transport rosters were being checked. The sergeant, his burned hands long healed into shiny scars, looked up as the young German stopped in front of him, straightened, and held out his hand. The air around them seemed to tighten. This was not prohibited, yet it crossed an invisible line of custom. Walker looked at the offered hand for 1 second, then took it. "Safe trip," he said. Otto nodded, unable to trust his English with anything larger, and climbed into the truck. Lise and Marta were moved later, first to another facility and then gradually through the chain of post-war release. Before she went, Marta left the old harmonica in the children's room because, she said, some sounds belonged more to the future than to the person who had borrowed them. Lise gave Haskins a square of embroidered cloth she had carried since before her internment, telling him, through broken English and help from a translator, that not all debts were meant to be repaid, only remembered. Haskins accepted it with the awkwardness of a man who preferred practical tasks to emotional recognition. "Take care on the road," he told her, which was his way of saying more than he could comfortably stand to hear himself say. Karl remained until the spring of 1946. By then the camp had thinned. The war had receded into aftermath. Men talked of discharge. Guards spoke of going home, of stores to reopen, farms to reclaim, marriages postponed too long, civilian life that seemed at once desirable and impossible. Haskins would leave the service soon. Walker, rumor had it, was staying a little longer because grief does not always know what to do in peacetime. In his final weeks, Karl found himself walking one afternoon to the edge of the ground where the western structure had burned. A new building stood nearby now, practical, plain, no plaque, no mark, nothing to suggest the night on which so many moral certainties had gone up in smoke. Only those who had been there could have pointed out where the roof had caved, where the side window had been broken, where Haskins had knelt in the mud, where the cut section of wire had opened the impossible path. On his last full day in camp, Karl returned a phrase sheet of English words Haskins had once lent him and a pencil worn almost to uselessness. The medic shoved both back into his hand. "Keep them," he said. "You'll need English at the docks." The sentence was delivered with the crispness of an order because kindness, among soldiers, often arrives wearing the uniform of instruction. Later that day Karl found Walker near the tool shed, inventorying equipment. Sunlight fell over the scars in the sergeant's palms. Karl looked at those hands, then at the fence, then back again. He searched for something adequate and found, as people often do in the important moments, only honesty stripped bare. "Texas," he said first, because it was the largest word available to him for everything that had happened there. Walker waited. Karl tried again. "Not what we were told." Walker held his gaze for a moment. Then, in a voice without triumph, without softness, without accusation, he answered, "A lot of things weren't. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was a truth large enough for both men to stand inside briefly without lying." The next morning Karl left the camp on a transport truck with a blanket roll, a tin cup, letters from home, the English phrase sheet, and a scar along his scalp where a burning splinter had caught him during the fire. He rode out past the gate, the towers, the water tank, the neat rows of structures, the same road by which he had entered, certain that America meant polished humiliation. He left with no illusions that captivity had been pleasant. He had been fenced, counted, restricted, searched, worked, and reminded every day that he was not free. But he had also been fed, treated when sick, protected from random vengeance, and, in the decisive moment, saved by men who could easily have let history take a simpler path. When he finally returned to Cologne, he found a city torn open. Buildings stood like broken teeth. Streets ended in rubble. Neighbors carried coal, grief, and rumors in equal measure. His sister was alive. His mother was dead. Their apartment was gone. Everyone wanted stories. Some wanted tales proving that German suffering had been pure and noble. Some wanted evidence that the enemy had been monstrous, because such evidence would have made defeat easier to bear. Karl disappointed them. He spoke of the camp truthfully. The fences, the routines, the labor, the censorship, the indignity of having one's life reduced to lists and permissions. But he also spoke of the Americans, of the storm night in Texas, of the broken door, of the wire cut open for rescue, of Walker's burned hands, of Haskins in the mud, of a young American guard trapped under a beam and saved by the man he guarded, of soup heated through the night for German prisoners, of children wrapped in American blankets, of a widower farmer who lost his son and still left peaches for enemy laborers. More than once people listening to him turned away, because the truth he carried was not flattering to anyone's convenient myth. Yet he went on telling it. He understood that after a war built on slogans, one of the few forms of dignity left was to describe what one had seen without improving it to suit bitterness. In the years that followed, when people asked Karl what he remembered most about the war, they expected the battlefield, the retreat, the capture, the Atlantic crossing, the surrender. He remembered all of that. But when he answered honestly, it was often Texas that came first. The flat horizon beneath a merciless sky, the sound of rain hitting wooden roofs, the shock of hearing Silent Night, sung in 2 languages through cold air and barbed wire, the sight of American soldiers running into flames for German prisoners, the shame of realizing that some of the deepest lies he had ever believed had not been exposed by argument but by conduct. He would say, if pressed, that the camp taught him 2 truths that could never again be separated. The first was that captivity strips away vanity quickly. The second was that power and cruelty are not identical unless people choose to fuse them. The Americans at Crystal City had possessed every advantage: food, weapons, freedom of movement, authority, victory drawing near. They could have allowed resentment, bureaucracy, or simple self-protection to harden into indifference. Instead, in the moment that mattered most, they chose not to become the thing they were fighting. For Karl, for Otto, for Lise, for Marta, and for others whose names history never recorded beyond a file number and a departure list, that choice changed the moral shape of the war forever. In the louder histories of empires, invasions, conferences, offensives, and capitulations, such moments occupy almost no space. They do not alter maps. They do not command parades. They are too human, too local, too resistant to propaganda. Yet they endure where it matters, in memory, in testimony, in the private court where a person judges what the world really was when the slogans burned away. In a German internment camp on American soil, behind wire and under watchtowers, a group of men and women arrived believing the enemy would strip them of the last remainder of their dignity. Instead, the deepest shock of their captivity was not cruelty, but the encounter with disciplined mercy. And for those who had crossed an ocean carrying fear like a second skeleton inside them, the night the Americans ran into fire to save them became the moment they first understood that history is not revealed only in the roar of armies, but also in the smaller, harder decision not to let power turn a human being into ash just because the law, the war, and the darkness might have made it easy.